Good afternoon, P5. Welcome back. We're going to continue our read aloud of Carrie's War by Nina Bodden. Yesterday I had asked you to read the first half of chapter 5. I'm going to continue the read aloud for the second half of chapter 5. So I won't be reading the whole chapter today because I think you've already done that reading. But you can follow along for the second half of the chapter with me while I read aloud today. So just to catch up before we get started, we have a better understanding of a new setting in the story now, Druid's Bottom. Druid's Bottom is the property where Dilys Gotobed, who was known as Dilys Evans prior to getting married, Mr. Evans' elder sister, she lives at Druid's Bottom, and she has a caretaker there who helps take care of her and the house, and that is Hepzibah, who I think the author does a really nice job of giving us a really good feeling about this character through her description. Very much like her kitchen, which is a warm and safe and well-lighted place. A lot of you have already noticed that Hepzibah is also being described as a very warm, open, safe person. So we have a really good idea for who she is through the description and different adjectives that are used to describe her. We've also rediscovered Albert Sandwich. We haven't heard much about him since the opening chapters, and he's been living at Druid's Bottom with Hepzibah. And he wasn't well. He was very ill, so that's why we haven't heard much from him. But now he's feeling better, and he's back in the story, which I think Carrie is very happy about. We've also met Mr. Johnny. Now, Carrie and Nick were very frightened of the sounds that they heard when they were in the wood leading to Druid's Bottom. We've now found out, though, nothing to be afraid of. It's another character named Mr. Johnny, who, from the descriptions that we get of him, we can probably understand that he has some developmental disabilities that have affected his speech and that have affected sort of his ability to take care of himself. He is fairly independent, as we'll see in the chapter as we move along, but it's also noted that Hepzibah has been taking care of Mr. Johnny since he was quite young. So he's a relative in the Gotobed family, who will become a regular character for us now in this story as well, who is sort of encircled in the warmth and safety of Hepzibah and her kitchen in Druid's Bottom. Okay, so, one last thing to note is that Druid's Bottom is the name of the property where Dilys Gotobed, Mr. Evans' older sister, is living. But the way that the author introduces that kitchen with those really powerful similes that give a strong image and strong pictures in our mind, that the kitchen, Hepzibah's kitchen in itself, is almost presented as a separate setting because she just fills this space with warmth and security. So we'll get started. I'm going to start at the bottom of page 69 in this copy of the book, so you can follow along with me. I'm just going to start sort of towards the very bottom of the page at the last paragraph. Here we go. She said, "Shouldn't we go back in the kitchen? I expect tea is ready by now." And it was. The cloth on the table was so stiffly starched that it stuck out at the corners. There was a huge plate of mince pies, golden brown and dusted with sugar, a tall jug of milk, a pink ham, and slices of bread thickly spread with the lovely, pale, sweaty butter Carrie had seen in the dairy. Nick was already at the table, tucking in, and Mr. Johnny sat beside him, a white napkin round his neck. He chuckled excitedly as Carrie came in, and she said, "Hello, Mr. Johnny. Can I sit next to you?" Albert looked at her approvingly. He said, "Hepzibah, I've been showing Carrie the skull. Tell her that old tale, won't you? Or will you? She'd like to hear it, though it's a lot of old nonsense, of course." Hepzibah put a brown teapot down on the table and aimed a fake blow at his ear. Just going to pause there for a moment. Hepzibah and Albert Sandwich, with this fake blow at his ear, they have a playful relationship. So that's a little action between the characters that allows us to infer or to understand that they do have a really good relationship that they've already developed. I'll give you nonsense, my lad. Mr. Albert Uppity Know-all. You don't know so much yet, or you would understand that wise people don't mock what they don't understand. Charsh, hishach, Johnny Go-to-Bed said. That's right, Mr. Johnny. Hepzibah bent over him, cutting up the ham on his plate. You've got more sense in your little finger than he's got in his clever young head. I'm sorry, Hepzibah, Albert said. Please tell Carrie. Oh, it's a foolish tale, his young lordship thinks. Hepzibah sat down, smiling at Carrie and smoothing her copper hair back. She had a rather broad face, pale as cream, and dotted with freckles. Carrie thought she looked beautiful, so warm and friendly and kind. She said, Please, Miss Green. Oh, Hepzibah, that's my name. Please, Hepzibah. Well then, perhaps I might, since you ask me so nicely. Fill up your plate now. Go on, you can manage a bit more, growing girl like you. It's not home-cured ham, I'm sorry to say, though it would have been once. They had a good home farm, the Go-to-Beds. They made their money out of sugar and slaves, and then moved here and made a fine place of the house. I heard about them long before I came to live here. When I was in service in Norfolk with Mr. Johnny's parents, they used to tell me about their rich cousins in Wales, and the screaming skull, and the curse on the house. It's a queer old story, too. We'll just pause there as well to discuss that one phrase in this paragraph that really stands out for me. They had made a good home farm, the Go-to-Beds. They made their money out of sugar and slaves and then moved here and made a fine place of the house. Now, we talked a little bit about the transatlantic slave trade when we were studying European exploration of North and South America. And I think that this particular sentence really stands out, going back to some of our conversations that we had there, where we see that there were some people that made quite a bit of money off of the misery and enslavement of others. And in this particular passage, Hepzibah talks about the sugar and slaves in the same paragraph, or in the same sentence. They're products. Sugar is a product. It's something that is consumed. And here they're talking about slaves, or people, as a product rather than as human beings. And we see that off of this misery and horror that was inflicted on people caught up in the slave trade, that some people made quite a bit of money off of that. And I think that's what links this story to the curse on the house, that the money was made on the backs of human beings that were being treated in absolutely unimaginable ways. So it's something to keep in mind, I think. It's a queer old story, too. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, staring in front of her and frowning a little. Then she put her cup down and began to speak in a soft, sad, dreaming voice that seemed to weave a spell of silence in the room. He was brought here, the African boy, when he was 10 or so. It was the fashion at that time for rich people to have a little black page, dressed up in silks and satins, riding on the step of their carriage. So they fetched this poor innocent away from his family, across the sea, to a strange land. And of course he cried, as many children might cry, as any child might cry, taken from his mother. The Go-to-Beds weren't hard people. The young ladies gave him sweets and toys and made a real pet of him, but they couldn't comfort him. And in the end, they said he could go back home one day. Perhaps they meant it, but he died of a fever his first winter here, and it must have seemed to him that they had broken a promise. So he put a curse on the house. He said on his deathbed that they could bury his body, but when his flesh had rotted, they must dig up his skull and keep it in the house, or some dreadful disaster would come. The walls would crumble, and they believed him. People believed in curses then, and they did what he said. The skull has been kept in the library ever since. It only left the house once, when old Mr. Go-to-Bed's grandmother was a girl. She couldn't abide the thought of it, sitting there, grinning. It gave her bad dreams, she said. So she took it one morning and hid it in the stable loft. Nothing happened at all. She waited all day to see, and then went to bed, no doubt very pleased with herself. But in the middle of the night there was a great scream, like a screech owl, and a loud crashing sound. And when the family came running down in their night clothes, all the crockery was smashed in the kitchen. All the glass in the dining room, every mirror in the house cracked to pieces. Then, of course, the girl said what she had done, and they fetched the skull back and had no trouble after. "With 16 teeth in its upper jaw," Albert said. "Count your teeth, Nick. You're the same age as that boy would have been. See if you've got 16. Nick blinked at him. Carrie said, "Oh, it's such a lovely story, Albert. Clever sandwich. Don't you dare spoil it." Though she thought secretly that it was a comfort to know it might not be true. She said in a sentimental voice, "A lovely, sad story. Poor little African boy. All that way from home." Nick sighed very deeply. Then he got down from his chair and went to stand by Hepzibah. He put his head on her shoulder, and she turned and picked him up and sat him on her broad lap, her arms tight about him. She rocked him gently, and he nestled close and put his thumb in his mouth. The room was quiet except for the hiss of the fire. Even Mr. Johnny sat still, as if the story had lulled him, though perhaps it was only the soft sound of Hepzibah's voice. I'm pausing here as well to share with you one of the observations from a classmate. I'm not going to say the classmate's name on the video since this is on the internet, but the student's name is on the novel study discussion group, so you'll know who it is when you read through that. One of the students made a very keen observation in comparing the way that Albert Sandwich tells the story of the skull and the way that Hepzibah tells the story. So Albert Sandwich is more steeped, his story is more steeped in facts and things that might be verified, evidence that you could take to the British Museum and have them tell you the dates and verify when this skull would have been sort of left at the property. Whereas Hepzibah's telling of the story is much more of it's like a legend. It's got more, the student said, supernatural elements to it, more of a myth. So we can use our imagination a little bit more, and the way that story is told really changes everything. And we see, even for the characters in the story, listening to Hepzibah's version of the story really kind of creates this sort of mystical, quiet, supernatural surrounding. So Hepzibah is really quite a powerful character. She can really connect emotionally with people. And she's really just connected with Nick, who has been so lulled by this story of hers that he's gone in for a cuddle to sit on her lap. And you want to pay close attention to the next bit of the reading, because this is related to the question that I've asked you in today's reading. So here we go. Page 74. Carrie looked at Nick on Hepzibah's lap and felt jealous. Of Nick, because she would like to be sitting there. She wasn't too big. And of Hepzibah, because she was comforting Nick in a way she knew she could never do. So I'm pausing again. Many of you have already observed in your reading that Carrie often hides her feelings from others. She doesn't really admit to her feelings when she's scared or upset or jealous or even excited. She hides those feelings, and I think that has a really big effect on Carrie. I think it sometimes hurts her. Here we have that she's jealous of Nick because she'd like to also climb up into Hepzibah's lap, and she's jealous of Hepzibah, who's comforting her brother, which is something that Carrie usually does, but she sees that she's not, or she believes that she's not capable of comforting her brother in the same way that Hepzibah is able to do now. My question, I always wonder, is how does this affect Carrie to constantly be hiding her feelings? How does she feel? Do you think she feels self-confident? Do you think that she feels good about herself? Do you think that her not being able to express herself and share her feelings honestly, do you think that has another effect on her that causes different behaviors that we might see? That's something to consider, because I think Carrie's a very complicated character because of this, for what we're seeing now, inability to share her feelings. So keep that in mind when you're reading, because it will help us to understand how Carrie's character develops through the story. Okay, here we go. She said, this is Carrie, "We ought to go, really. Auntie Lou knew we might stay to tea, but it's getting late now and she'll start to worry." Then she thought of going back through the dark trees, and her stomach seemed to sink down inside her. That noise she had heard, that deep sighing breath. Perhaps what she was feeling showed in her face, because Albert said, "I'll come with you if you like, as far as the railway." "Oh, not with your chest you won't," Hepzibah said. Albert grinned. "I could hardly go without it, could I? Go on, Hepzibah. I'm strong as a horse now, and I could do with some air." "Not night air," Hepzibah said. "Besides, I want you to come and read to Mrs. Gotobed while I settle her. It puts her mind at rest for the night. Mr. Johnny will see them safe through the grove." She smiled at Carrie, her eyes so bright suddenly that Carrie felt they saw straight into her mind. Though this was an odd feeling, it wasn't frightening somehow. Hepzibah said, "You'll be all right with him. No harm of the kind you're afraid of ever comes near the innocent." Carrie said, "Mr. Evans says no harm can ever come to those who trust in the Lord." "Perhaps that's another way of saying the same thing," Hepzibah said. She gave Nick one last hug and tipped him off her lap. "Come again, love, both of you, whenever you like. Are you ready, Mr. Johnny?" He seemed to understand her. He was on his feet, holding out his hand to Nick, who went to join him and took it trustingly. And so Mr. Johnny took them up through the dark yew trees, carrying the goose and holding Nick's hand. Carrie walked behind because there wasn't room for three on the path, but she wasn't afraid. Mr. Johnny talked in his gobbly voice all the way, and it seemed a friendly noise now, pushing the night back. Gobble, gobble, chuckle, chuckle. After a bit, to Carrie's surprise, Nick began to talk too, as if answering. He said things like, "Oh, yes, she was, wasn't she?" And, "Oh, yes, I'd love to do that." Carrie thought he was just being polite, but when they reached the railway line and Mr. Johnny set the goose down and said, "Girly, girly," she knew what he was trying to say. She said, "Goodbye, Mr. Johnny," and smiled at him. And at first he tried to smile back, twitching the good side of his mouth. Then he covered his face with his small, fluttery hands and backed shyly away. "Don't look straight at him like that," Nick said. "It upsets him, people looking. Goodbye, Mr. Johnny." They took the goose between them and set off along the line that shone silver in the moonlight. When they put the heavy bag down for a rest and looked back, Mr. Johnny had gone. Carrie said, "He was trying to say goodbye, wasn't he? You didn't understand anything else that he said, did you?" "Not really. I mean, I couldn't." "Only because you weren't listening," Nick said, rather smugly. "All right, then. What did he say? Come on, since you think you're so clever." "If you carry the goose, it's too heavy. It hurts my poor arm." Oh, sorry, I've read that wrong. Nick's response to Carrie is that he'll only tell her if she carries the goose. Sorry. "If you carry the goose, it's too heavy. It hurts my poor arm. Baby." But she picked the bag up and staggered along while Nick skipped beside her, jumping the sleepers. He said, between jumps, he said a lot of things. He said we must come back again and he'd show us his cow. He said he'd show us his cow and then where the gulls nest up on the mountain. He said he liked us and wanted us to come back, though he liked me the best. He said you were cross because I sat on Hepzibah's lap. Now, we'll pause here to talk about a few things that are happening. Nick has been presented mostly through Carrie's point of view as a baby, as someone who can't take care of himself. But here we have Nick actually showing a great deal more maturity than his sister has in the way that he has treated Mr. Johnny with respect. As soon as he realized, oh, Mr. Johnny is a man, maybe he has a different way of speaking and a different way of interacting, but Nick right away trusts him and starts really listening carefully to him, whereas Carrie maintains her distance from Mr. Johnny because she's still feeling a little bit frightened. So I think that speaks to Nick's maturity and Nick's ability to connect with his feelings, which again is an ability that seems to be challenging for Carrie to do. The other thing that we learn here is that Mr. Johnny is actually quite perceptive. He said, "You were cross because I sat on Hepzibah's lap." So we know this because the narrator has told us that Carrie was feeling jealous when Nick was on Hepzibah's lap. And Mr. Johnny was also able to understand that. So Mr. Johnny may have a different way of speaking. He may have difficulties with speaking. He may have difficulties with one side of his mouth. And he does require some help. We see Hepzibah lean over and cut his food for him when they're eating. But he has the ability to build relationships with people, and he's very perceptive about what he sees going on around him. So we learn a lot in this little interaction. We learn a lot about Nick, we learn a lot about Carrie, and we learn a lot about Mr. Johnny. And I think we're starting to see that all of these things that Carrie says about her little brother being scared and being a baby, actually, Nick seems to be a bit more capable than Carrie does at points. And this is one of those points. Okay, so let's continue. He said, "You were cross because I sat on Hepzibah's lap." "Liar," Carrie said. "You're making it up. What a mean, dirty trick." He looked at her slyly. "Well, you were cross, weren't you?" "But only because you're too old for that sort of thing. It made you look silly." "It didn't feel silly," Nick said. "It felt nice." Carrie looked at him and saw his mouth turning down at the corners. Carrie said, "Oh, don't cry. I can't bear it. I wish we lived there. Albert Sandwich is lucky. But if we lived there, we wouldn't have it to look forward to, would we? I mean, we can look forward to going there. Not every day, of course, but once a week perhaps, and that'll be nice. Hepzibah did say we could go whenever we liked, didn't she?" Here's Carrie again now trying to cheer up her brother as he's starting to get a bit sad. And in this little speech of hers, we're actually seeing that she is capable of finding the positives in a negative situation, which is a pretty important trait for her to have, even if we don't see it all the time. Okay, she put the goose down and looked at Nick. He said, "Oh, Carrie, I don't want to look forward. I want to be there all the time. I don't want to go back to the Evanses. I really don't. I never did want to be there, but it's worse now. Not better. I want to go home." Carrie knew what he meant. Sitting in that lovely, bright, happy kitchen had made the Evanses' house seem colder and bleaker than ever. But Nick was working himself up into one of his states, and she had to harden her heart. She said, "Then want must be your master, Nicholas Peter Willow. Pull yourself together this minute and help me with this goose." Now, this is a very interesting conclusion for this chapter. Whose words is Carrie using? Want must be your master. We've heard this phrase before, and it was Mr. Evans who spoke it. So Carrie is feeling very badly for her brother, and she understands why her brother is so upset now that he's been able to compare life with the Evans to life in Hepzibah's kitchen. But in order to protect Nick, she has to harden her heart. She has to make sure that she's not as emotional as her brother so that she can make her brother feel better. So we see the effect that Carrie does feel sort of duty-bound to protect her brother at all times, but we see that this has a negative effect on her. We have lots of examples in this story so far as to Carrie hiding her feelings and not really being honest about them. And sometimes maybe that's motivated by her being a little bit shy, as some of you have observed. And sometimes it may be motivated by the fact that she's trying to protect her brother, to protect Nick, because he is very free and open with his emotions. And so Carrie sometimes feels that she has to balance that out by being a little bit more hard. I think that this also can give us a little window into Mr. Evans' personality. Is he like Carrie? Does he have to harden his heart because he's trying to protect other people? We haven't really learned that much about Mr. Evans yet, but I suspect that this might be a little bit of foreshadowing. This might be the author giving us a little bit of a clue that there is a bit of a key that could help us unlock and better understand Mr. Evans. All right, so we'll stop there for today. Tomorrow I will not be assigning new reading. Tomorrow I will be sending you the novel study discussion group with the input that you have sent to me both today and yesterday. So please send me your thoughts, your ideas, your questions that come up as you read, and we'll go from there. So it's been a pleasure to read to you again today, and I look forward to speaking with you and seeing you soon. Okay, have a nice afternoon, and we will talk soon. Bye for now.